The heavily debated Operation Overlord that Churchill had so stubbornly resisted in Tehran was a gamble that only had one chance.
Although all logic said that the Allies, with an overwhelming superiority of armor, ships, aircraft, were overwhelmingly likely to get ashore and be able to stay there, if they failed, the consequences would be disastrous, and every man involved with planning and preparing that invasion knew just how high the stakes were.
The operation's two commanders, the US General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his British counterpart Bernard Law Montgomery, spent months in the planning, eventually settling on the location, a 50-mile stretch of wide sandy beaches in Normandy.
The Normandy Beaches along the French coastline were chosen for a couple of reasons. First, you needed to have an area that was big enough to disembark 130,000 men. That's a lot of men, and you had to be able to move them on shore. So that was a good coastline for that reason.
The peninsula was viewed as being something that could be taken over. There was the port of Cherbourg, which was viewed as being potentially able to be captured and used as a major port for bringing in supplies. So it was a whole raft of factors which combined to make it the best place to go.
Delayed by unseasonably bad weather, D-Day arrived at midnight on the 6th of June, when over 18,000 British and American troops landed by parachute and gliders on either flank of the seaborne landing sites. Then, at 6:30 a.m., a massive flotilla began to deliver over 130,000 men and 20,000 vehicles onto the long, wide beaches, the code names for which have become synonymous with that day. Omaha and Utah, upon which the Americans would land Sword, Gold, and Juno for the British and Canadians.
The Germans were caught by surprise by the actual timing of the attack. They were reasonably well prepared, but they suffered from having failed to agree whether they would deal with the invasion immediately and have all the possible forces as close as possible, and bear in mind that they weren't sure where the Allies would come ashore, or whether they would let the Allies come ashore in sufficient numbers and then attempt to have a mass attack, particularly using their concentrated armor.
Despite a naval bombardment from close to 1,000 ships and an utterly dominant display by the Allied air forces, who flew over 14,000 sorties on the day, there were some amongst the Wehrmacht who were unconvinced by the show of force. Chief amongst them was Adolf Hitler.
He didn't want to be awakened on D-Day, and by the time he gets out of bed, the battle's half over. And then you also have a situation where the Americans have deceived the Germans into thinking that the D-Day invasion on June 6th was a decoy, a secondary invasion.
Overlord offered Hitler his last, just credible opportunity of the war to turn the tide against the Allies. He had a scenario, not a very convincing one, but just possible, whereby if he could throw the Allies back into the sea when they invaded, then he could shift all his important forces, above all the Panzer divisions, back to the Eastern Front, smash the Russians, and then come and deal with the Americans, the British, at leisure.
D-Day is the name given to that entire day, not just the landings. And despite the success of the seaborne operation, securing the beachheads was never going to be a cakewalk. The Allies suffered 10,000 casualties on June the 6th, of which 5,000 occurred on Omaha Beach alone, where the Americans, pinned down by German positions on the facing cliffs, suffered losses at a ratio of 5 to 1. And just as the landings were not the entirety of D-Day, D-Day was just the start of Operation Overlord, whose goal was to establish a strong Allied fighting presence on the continent. With the beachhead secured, Allied troops and equipment poured in, protected from the weather by temporary mulberry harbors, and supported by underwater pipelines pumping precious fuel to keep the operation mobile. By late July, the port of Cherbourg had been captured, and nearly 2 million Allied troops and tens of thousands of their heavy weapons and vehicles were in Europe. The largest seaborne invasion in history had been completed. Now, the real battle would begin.